is kind of weird to say considering I've only made like one video on this channel. I'll be looking at an article by young Earth creationist Paul Price for Creation Ministries International, where he's an events manager. In this article, Paul argues against the position that I hold, where animal death is not a result of man's sin. I met Paul about 6 months ago over on the r/creation subreddit. We've engaged in one video chat with another guy named Salvador Cordova. He's a really awesome guy. And from there, we've had discussions on Reddit off and on for the past few months. This video is specifically a response to an article of his, but I'd like to quickly say a few words about some of Paul's misrepresentations of my views. In regards to the flood, he said that I think it happened 4,500 years ago. He said that I reject what Peter says in 2 Peter 3, many more erroneous claims. It's quite unfortunate. So all I would say is if you were redirected here from one of my or Paul's subreddit posts on r/creation, feel free to message me on Reddit to clarify my views, and anything that you hear from Paul regarding my views, please take it with a grain of salt. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to edit this video yet, so his article may be on one side of the screen and my face on the other. I'll try to read a few sentences or a paragraph and then respond to them from an old Earth creationist theological perspective, where animal death is not a result of man's sin. Let's get into this. Paul writes, biblical creationists teach the historic Christian view that all kinds of death, corruption, decay, etc., anything less than very good according to God, are ultimately a result of God's just punishment for the sin of Adam in the garden. Prior to the fall and the curse, this creation existed in a state which exactly matched God's original will. One may call this paradise. This idyllic state would have been persuasive across all creation, on all domains. There would have been no corruption or death in the animal kingdoms, just as there was none for mankind. Let's get into this. So Paul sneaks into that paragraph this assertion that his view is the biblical one. This is very common among creation.com articles where they label themselves as biblical creationists, and I understand that's their position on it. But I don't like it because this entire thing, the point of this topic, is to come to a conclusion of whose view is biblical. So while arguing for our position, casually throwing out, hey, we're the biblical creationists, simply doesn't do anything for us. It isn't necessary, and it doesn't add anything to the conversation. Because I, arguing for the other side, already know that you think you're the biblical side, and I think I'm biblical. This is the point of the entire discussion, like I said, to come to the conclusion of who is biblical, rather than just asserting I'm biblical and you're not. Secondly, he says something very interesting. He says that the, quote, historic Christian view that all kinds of death, corruption, and decay, etc., or that's the quote right there. And then he goes on to say, are a result of man's sin, right? I'm extremely skeptical of this claim that that this view specifically is the historical Christian view. And I'd like to share with you a few quotes that seem to disprove this pretty hard. And Paul, if you're listening, I'd love to see your evidence from what seems to be a pretty outlandish claim. Also, I might be using some slides from an upcoming debate I'll be having on the topic with Cody Sorensen. Excuse me. Thomas Aquinas writes, in this opinion of some, those animals which now have been fierce and kill others would, in that state, the Garden of Eden, have been tame, not only in regard to man, but also in regard to other animals. But this is quite unreasonable, for the nature of animals was not changed by man's sin. If you're interested more on Aquinas' view, see the Pints with Aquinas podcast episode on this topic. You should find it on YouTube pretty easily. Secondly, I'd like to point out, share a quote from St. Basil, who wrote in the Hexameron that, so nature, being put in motion by the one command, passes equally through birth and death in a creature, while it keeps up the succession of kinds through resemblance to the end. Because it is so that a horse succeeds to a horse, a lion to a lion, an eagle to an eagle. And while every one of the living beings is preserved by these uninterrupted successions, she directs them to the end, or all of them to the end. And would you like to know the most absolute ironic thing about all of this? It's so incredibly ironic. It makes me wonder if Paul Price disagrees with some of his fellow Institute for not Institute for Creation Research, I mean Creation Ministries International folks. I found the quote from St. Basil in a paper on creation.com that showcased the variety of different views on creation in regards to animal death. And it demonstrates different views by the church fathers, etc. Such as some different views by such as Calvin, who's mentioned in this paper, who thought humans were created mortal. Obviously, the writer of this paper, Benno Zuidiam, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. And again, this is on Creation Ministries International, the same ministry that Paul works for. I'm not sure that he would agree with Paul Price's view of death before the fall. But from how I interpret his paper, he would disagree strongly that this view is a historic Christian view. Rather, he would think that there wasn't a specific orthodox understanding of these passages. And I'll put the paper in the description. So, yeah, what we found is that not even Paul's interpretation of the text being, his interpretation being the only orthodox position, which is far from the truth, even someone from his own ministry who majored in church history would disagree with him on this topic. Again, obviously these two guys agree on the biblical interpretation. I'm not saying they don't. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't be so apt to accept Paul's clearly false assertions. Here's the quote from the article on creation.com, the one I mentioned about 10 seconds ago, which I'll have a link in the description. Actually, the paper, not the article. This is the paper by Paul's colleague on Creation Ministries International. For Basil, animals belonged to the realm of non-human nature, where death was not only acceptable, but viewed as a natural principle. In the paper, Benno also says, Basil wrote relatively late, but his views on the subject seem to reflect what was regarded as an acceptable interpretation in the late 4th century. As far as I'm concerned, this is an absolute knockdown argument against Paul's unequivocally false assertion, and it comes from one of his own, a young earth creationist who writes content for the same ministry. Next, he brings up the objection that the term very good in Genesis 1 limits creation to having been needed to be free of animal death. This is wrong for many reasons. Good in Hebrew, as a quick glance at Brown Driver Briggs will show, can mean many different things depending on context. One definition in Strong's is pleasant, agreeable, good. I love the analogy that Michael Jones gives. If I were to say right now that my car is good, and then I were to say that God is good, I would be using different meanings of the word good. In regards to God, I'd be referring to him as a maximally great being possessing all perfections. When I'm referring to my car, I'd be referring to it functioning properly. Again, a quick glance at BDB will show that this is very similar to how the Hebrew word functions. The same one being used in Genesis 1. There are dozens and dozens of examples of it being used in loads of different ways, obviously. Lots of times it's used to describe when something's functioning properly, or like when Abraham dies in Genesis 25, what is normally translated as ripe in reference to his old age, is actually the same word being used in Genesis 1 for good. So now that I've got those definition stuff out of the way, let's take a look at the context of how very good is used in Genesis 1. And just a quick note, for Paul, I'd be curious to know what in the context of Genesis 1 makes you think that very good is in reference to a perfect animal, non-carnivorous state. It seems rather interesting that it just happens to be referring to a pre-fall state of animal vegetarianism. At least to me it seems somewhat ad hoc, or when his interpretation is necessary or requires it. I'd like to show how this understanding of very good, meaning perfect or without any flaw or corruption, as Paul puts it, doesn't work at all. Because within the Genesis creation account, before the fall, there are things that don't fit that description. First, notice how in the beginning of Genesis 1, and I'd like to encourage you to read it for yourself, there is darkness. The earth was formless and void. What this really represents, as many scholars have picked up on, is chaos. Genesis 1 is truly beautiful as it presents God taking a chaotic state and sovereignly making things orderly. A quick side note, if Paul thinks that Genesis 3 is focusing in on the activities of the sixth day, creation at the sixth day is called very good, even though it was already fallen. Next, as Hulasani Ramatswana points out in his PhD dissertation, it's titled, God saw that it was very good, not perfect. The good creation characterized by the multiple rebellions that took place within the creation process. 1. The rebellion by the sea serpent, otherwise known as the dragon, Leviathan, or Rahab. 2. Rebellion of the land serpent of Genesis 3. And 3. Rebellion by mankind. Now, the sea serpent / Leviathan / chaos dragon, or Rahab, is something that I'll get into on another video, and Ben Stanhope has made some great videos on this topic. Perhaps when I'm done with that video and I upload it, I'll put a link in the description. So another question for Paul would be, was the snake in the garden very good? As Holasani writes, and this is just another very, very interesting good point. Secondly, as Holasani writes, the refrains of Genesis 1, and specifically the final refrain, are no claim for the perfection of creation. I am convinced that if the author of Genesis had wanted to express the idea of perfection, he would have simply gone with different terminology than tamim, or not tamim, in this case it's tov. There are two Hebrew words which carry the notion of perfection or are translatable as perfect. The first one is the adjective tamim, or for the short, and then he kind of gets into the Hebraic root word there a little bit, which expresses the idea of wholeness, soundness, completeness, entirety, fullness. And then he gives some examples. It is most often used for human mortality, carrying the idea of blameless, or following the Lord wholeheartedly, and he gives some more examples. Also, sacrificial animals were presented without blemish, same word there. It is also used to describe the ways of God or his works. See Deuteronomy 34:2, 2 Samuel 22:31, verses 33, Job 12:4, etc. Second is shalem. I believe that's how it's pronounced, at least. When used adjectively, it also carries the idea of wholeness, completeness, soundness, peace. As La Rondelle argues, the word perfect is neither applied to the empirical world nor to the static metaphysical world, but to the dynamic world of God's actions and the concrete revelation of his will. In the Old Testament, God is the norm of perfection. He is the rock. His work is perfect. Deuteronomy 32. As for God, his way is perfect. 2 Samuel. The law of the Lord is perfect. So this is a very, very interesting point that I want to bring up to Paul and you, the listener. Anyways, there's tons of... But yeah, basically the argument would just be if it were to sort of teach this perfect, idyllic creation without any corruption, there's different Hebraic terms that would be used for that, not the one that's being used. Anyways, though, there's tons of stuff I could say on this topic of very good in Genesis 1, so I'll say one more short thing on it, and then perhaps in the future I'll make an in-depth video on it. You may know the argument based upon Psalm 104 against Paul's position, not the Apostle Paul Price that I'm discussing. This is a very good argument, and again, excuse me, I just had some hummus. This is a very good argument, and I will make it in another video perhaps, but I want to focus on one thing particular in the argument. The fact that animal death is called good, using the same word in Genesis 1, and this is in Psalm 104. Let me just read from Psalm 104, specifically verses 27 through 31. This is out of the New American Standard, 1995. They all wait for you to give them their food in due season. You give it to them, they gather it up, you open your hands, they are satisfied with good. You hide your face, they are dismayed, you take away their spirit, they expire, and return to the dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Let the glory of the Lord endure forever. Let the Lord be glad in his works. Do you see what it's teaching? I'd encourage you to go read these verses for yourself. It's very quite simple. The context of they all wait for you is of all of God's creatures. And if you don't believe me, go read it for yourself. Notice how just a few verses earlier we read, You appoint the darkness and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God. When the sun rises, they withdraw and lie down in their dens. Man goes forth to his work and to his labor until evening. So even if it's not talking about all of God's created creatures, which in the context of Psalm 104, it definitely is, we literally have lions, carnivorous animals, being mentioned, like 3, 4 verses earlier. So according to this, carnivorous animals receiving their food from God is good. Not quite something we'd expect on Paul's interpretation of Genesis 1. Anyways, I think I've said enough on the topic of very good in Genesis 1, but perhaps I'll make, like I said earlier, a dedicated video to this in the future. In the following videos in the series, I'll be slowly going through the rest of Paul's article. It's probably going to go pretty slow because there's a lot of issues, or at least the parts that are relevant to this topic. I'll be covering his arguments from Isaiah 11, Romans 5, Genesis 1:29, let the animals eat vegetation or whatever, which, ironically, he's not going to mention the verse prior, which refutes his argument. And then finally, the all-important citations from Romans 8 and the decay of creation, which will be demonstrated to not help his case at all. So, like I've also shown, creation.com sort of has some material that seems to be in conflict. On one side, Paul Price is saying, well, this is the historic Christian view, and then on another paper by Benno, he's saying, well, no, actually there were a wide variety of different views. Here's Thomas Aquinas' view, here's St. Basil's view, and then he gets into like Irenaeus' view, and there's some conflict there, and he's saying how in the 4th century, St. Basil's view, where it was a natural principle, death was, is quite common in the 4th century. So clearly there's some conflict going on, and that's kind of concerning for a ministry when they have different publications and papers and articles that seem to conflict with each other. And so that's a big concern I have, which I think should be addressed. But anyways, I want to say thank you for watching, and definitely if you want to speak with me about this or schedule a debate or anything, I'd love to do it. And yeah, you can just email me or talk to me on Reddit or Discord. And Paul, if you're watching, I'd love to discuss this with you. I know we've done it a ton on Reddit, and that's got very heated. And I know you and Salvador aren't talking anymore. But if you'd like to discuss it here in the channel, I'd be willing to do that. Anyways, God bless, and I will catch you in the next video.